Right. Well, we'll go ahead and get started now that we've got Leslie with us. He's one of our key players for a number of reasons, not the least of which he takes the minutes or the notes for us. So thank you, Leslie, for that and for being with us. I want to express my appreciation for each of you taking time out of your day to join us for this next 3 hours. We have some important topics to discuss and hopefully recommendations to be made that we can take forward to the State Board of Education in their October board meeting. If you want to go to the next slide, the agenda slide, Scott. This is just an overview of what we hope to be able to accomplish today. We've strategically placed a few things in order of preference in case we run long. We've got some of our highest priority issues at the beginning of the agenda. So I expect there'll be, I know the Center for Assessment has they prepared some wonderful information for us, and I expect to have some meaningful dialogue among the AAPAC committee members and hopefully some decisions that will come out, again, recommendations we can take to our Board of Education on these moving forward. I don't want to spend too much time at the beginning. The next slide, though, is going to show you 4 key decisions that we hope to accomplish, and there might be some other things that come up during our discussion. Obviously, as we look forward, this group's responsibility is to advise the board around assessment and accountability issues and connect the board to the public, which each of you represent different public entities within the education community. So again, the first one, we're going to look at growth and how growth is impacted by the suspension of assessment in the spring of 2020. We'll talk about a possible addendum, the pros and cons of that in relationship to accountability moving forward with the federal accountability requirements. And then the last 2 items on here are issues that have come forward from our Utah Association of Assessment Directors. It's been several months ago, but they brought these concerns forward with our identification of CSI and TSI schools, and then also our identification of EL student groups for TSI. And so we'll address the concerns that they brought forward. And those are our big topics today. Let's go to the next slide, actually the very next one. Just to review, I'd like to review with this committee the work that's been accomplished since the last time we met, which was in May. In February, this actually started some of these, and then we continued those into our discussion in May. The assessment strategic plan, many of you who are on this call today have participated in that actively. Those of you who aren't, we'll have an update time allowing at the end of today's meeting with that. We're still on track to have that plan completed and to the board late fall, hopefully in November, December probably at the latest. We still are on schedule to publish the school report card or the data dashboard. Obviously, there'll be lots of elements that won't be included this year. I've listed some of the elements that we have collected, and we're right now trying to stage ourselves to where we can release that dashboard by the end of September. An issue that we talked at length in February and briefly again about in March or in May was this turnaround exit criteria. The staff has taken direction from the board in their February board meeting. I've sought feedback from various stakeholder groups and are bringing back to the board recommendations to refine and change the turnaround exit criteria. Some of the highlights of that, it's scheduled to go to the Standard Assessment Committee in October. For those of you who have more interest, I would encourage you to participate or engage with it at that time, is clarifying that there'll be 4 years in turnaround with possible exit on 3rd year. Remember, this is a proposal at the time. The board has not acted on this. So just to qualify my statements and just to update you on the work that we've done to date, these are not finalized. We've also taken the direction from our stakeholder groups to make the exit criteria a criterion referenced exit instead of a norm reference. And so I've put in there some language that comes out of our proposed rule change about identifying a threshold, setting a target of reducing the gap between the target where you want to go in that 4-year time period. so that schools, when they're identified for turnaround, will have a clear target of what they need to achieve to be able to exit the turnaround program. Let's go to the next slide, Scott. Just an update on where we're at right now with assessment as we move into the 2021 school year. KEEP and Acadience testing has begun across the state of Utah. They're the earliest statewide assessments that are attempted. We've had LEAs completing these. The board has given staff the flexibilities to adjust deadlines on the delivery of the assessment and also the reporting of those assessments. We've had several LEAs reach out to us and request the flexibility. We still anticipate by November having all of that early data, the beginning of year cadence, and also our KEEP entry assessment. And we're in the process of formulating the research questions so that we conduct early analysis on the impacts of COVID-19 on our students across the state. These will be our first data points to allow us to do some comparative analysis on previous years, as well as with Acadience be able to analyze the gap between middle of year, school year 19 to beginning of year school year 20 and look at that comparative data on all the previous years that we've administered that. We've also worked with our vendors to provide flexibility where possible for remote proctoring of the various productivity tools or formative type products that are available to our teachers. And then as we finished up the ACT testing last year, we had almost 33,000 of our juniors were able to complete the ACT test during the early testing window before we shut things down in March, I think around March 13th. We've worked with ACT as well as other states have to allow the students who weren't able to complete the ACT testing on our statewide required assessment vouchers. We've had just about 3,000 of those vouchers have been redeemed. Students receive those vouchers through their schools, and then they have the opportunity to register for a national ACT test date to still obtain an ACT score, as we view that as a property right for our students and encourage them to redeem those vouchers. We'll get more information at the conclusion of the September and October national test dates, but I just wanted to give you just an overview of where we were at with testing from last year. And then I'm going to turn the time over to Dr. Marion to lead us into this next section, which is, again, kind of a big one for us, and that is determining how to deal with calculating student growth, given that we have a year where there was no assessment data collected. So, Scott, will you go ahead and begin?
Happy to. So before we get into growth, we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of the assessment options, because if who knows what's going to happen by midwinter as people have been inside for a while, if schools will close down. Utah, I think, has done a better job of opening schools than most places, but there's still, as far as I know, a lot of kids learning remotely. So that has some implications for how we think about assessment. So we're going to talk about this for about 20 minutes or so before I turn it over to Damien and Leslie to talk about growth issues. So obviously this is not a surprise to anyone. There's a lot of challenges to thinking that that we could just have a status quo approach to statewide summative assessment. And there's lots of ways to try to get data, because many of us believe that we do need data to help us get a sense of where kids are struggling. We have some good senses of that, but how, if we had the ability to redirect resources or direct additional resources, how would we use those data? How can we gather those data to enable us to make those decisions? We're going to have a plan B, C, and D, and I joke that it's even though he's been out of boxing a long time, I find myself quoting Mike Tyson this year more than I ever have in my whole life. When I asked in an interview one time, somebody said, "Well, this other fighter said he's got a great plan to beat you, Mike. What do you think you're going to do about that?" And his response was, "Everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face." And COVID has been I think the punch in the face to all of us trying to make plans. And so We were concerned about equity. We know that these technology issues have a tremendous effect on the opportunity to learn, which in turn then has a non-random, right? It's not random. It's concentrated in certain groups and locations. A non-random influence on test scores, and this will be a threat even if we could test all kids in buildings. Because of the differential access to instruction during this time. But if testing is remote, the uneven distribution of both internet bandwidth, right, the first part, and then the technology tools to be able to access the internet, it's going to be a major threat to the validity of test scores. So we have to be thinking about this all the time. So what are some of the major threats to high-quality summative assessments? We just mentioned equity, right? Then there's utility, right? Are the assessment results, if are they fair and accurate? And if so, are they useful measures of student achievement? Can we use them to redirect resources? Can we use them to identify students who might need additional support to help them meet grade level expectations? One of the primary threats to summative assessment in 2020 are having the resources necessary to support it, and do those resources, for instance, instructional time, are the cost benefits worth it? And then I've suggested in certain cases, especially with little kids or kids who have identified disabilities or English language learners, that it might be better to actually bring them into the schools, because many of our remote testing platforms are not able to offer the same accommodations. And so can we bring certain kids into schools to have them test, or all kids rotating through? Well, we have to worry about safety first and things like that, and the feasibility of getting these kids in. So these is not an exhaustive list, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. So, if you talk to an assessment person, a measurement person, it sounds like we sound like a broken record sometimes. We always say it's about purpose and use, and and the reason why that's so important, because tests are validated. The way that we judge whether or not they're good is always in the context of specific purposes and uses. So as you see here, the purpose of most state assessments is to provide an accurate measure of students' knowledge and skills, and that's usually related to state content standards. The assessments, or state assessments, are used to support achievement and growth indicators as part of school accountability systems, and they're often also used for monitoring long-term trends and things like that. So on the following slides, I outlined some potential threats to state summative assessment and options for addressing these threats, assuming that we still want to use these data for accountability. We're not necessarily advocating for this, but we're just trying to present alternatives. So here's one, right? Students do not have appropriate access. I'm not going to torture you and read every one of these, but students don't have appropriate access to participate fairly in instruction and assessment. So what's an option is to use CARES funding and other funding to make sure all students are connected in a decent way to the internet and with decent devices. Right now, what's a benefit? A collateral benefit here is this would be a breakthrough for providing all students with online access to high quality resources. The limitations, right? That CARES funding is one-time funding. I see Kim has raised a hand. Kim, I don't know if you have an
ignore that.
All right, sorry. Okay. So anyway, and then so we continue on this thread of equitable access. Think about utility, right? So one of the threats is there's too much content to cover, and especially in light of sporadic learning last spring, or maybe more hybrid situations this year. So one option is to adjust the blueprint of the current tests, such as certain groups are talking about prioritized standards. a key benefit, right, is the content would be linked to these priority learning targets. The downside, an important downside, is could break comparability, and it could require some new psychometric work. And Brent, our teacher, says he's already a week behind, and it's only the second week of September. It's because it's hard. Limited resources. One of the things we've talked about. You don't have time or money to develop a new form for 2021, and this is a little different in the computer adaptive testing environment, is to reuse an old form. In the case of Utah, we're in the middle of switching to vendors, so there's an item bank prepared, and this doesn't apply as much, but we could be thinking about the length of the test. I'm going to keep moving here. Certain logistics, right? If we need to continue, and I think we will, keep students at appropriate social distances, it's going to be tough to pack them in an auditorium or a gymnasium to do mass testing. And so we, even in classrooms that typically hold 30 kids, you might have to spread them out in different ways. So you might have to extend your testing windows to allow for smaller groups. And so doing so might be a real benefit for students with special needs by being able to test. The downside to anyone who works in schools is that now you're taking a lot of time through. The longer the testing window, the more intrusion it makes in the daily functioning of schools and instruction. If you're threat or logistically that you're unable to test because kids are in remote settings, well, there's a remote administration / remote proctoring option that Cambium Assessment Incorporated, the current test vendor for Utah, has. We'll be seeing some presentations about that at the Technical Advisory Committee meeting tomorrow and Friday, and it's actually a pretty good system. It's, but again, you could give the test, and you have to think about the interpretation. So that would at least help mitigate some concerns about bringing kids into school. But we have to think about comparability when you have either all or some of the kids remote. So one of the things we said, so let's say, and then all these things we're talking about are trying to gather data with the assumption that we would still use it for school accountability. But then we asked, and this is drawn from work that my colleague Chris Domaleski and I have been working on. It'll be a forthcoming paper. But what if we said that we're not going to use the results for high-stakes accountability, but it was more about support and monitoring? We don't know if the feds will allow this. I think if I was betting, I would say it's probably even money that the feds will allow some amendments to, or are they calling them addendum, to current state waivers on accountability. But based on what we know, any of the options I'm going to now suggest would require an accountability amendment, but at least it would allow us to gather data on what kids know. And again, not advocating for these, we're just trying to think broadly. We'll certainly take questions as you have them, right? And so one of the things about thinking about utility, the equity slide would still stay, but for the sake of time, I took it out here. But one of the things is because, districts are in such different places in terms of the percent of kids who are remote versus in person, the resources they have, maybe a uniform approach to assessment is not the right way to go. And you could transfer the assessment responsibility to LEAs. And so the state could say, we have these interim tools, for example, you guys administer them when you think they fit and how best you think they fit. That would certainly allow for tailoring to the local context, but the LEA capacity varies, and if they don't use the state test, they might rely on lower quality tests, and comparability will be out the window if we go with this approach. Again, I'm not suggesting any of these approaches. I'm just saying, how can we collect data to find out what kids know and are able to do if we if we're not able to administer a state test under accountability use context. Maybe standardized tests because of the constraints of remote administration. I joke with folks as I say, a lot of state tests have parts of the test that are calculator enabled and other parts where you're not allowed to use the calculator. So if you tell me that I'm not allowed to use the calculator on a part of the test, but I have my phone right here, now you see it and now you don't. And so it's pretty easy. We shouldn't set kids up to be dishonest. But if you think, boy, if I just Googled that answer, I think I could find it. So these standardized tests might not support accurate interpretations, and so we might want to think about other options such as performance assessments, portfolios. Again, the same concerns. This is certainly break trends, break comparability, and it's really burdensome if people aren't already practiced at developing these kinds of things. If you have limited resources to test all kids, if you were trying to bring kids into schools. So one of the things, you could sample students. Now this raises obvious challenge to growth, measuring growth, right? If you're sampling students and you want to have consistent year-over-year testing of kids to evaluate growth, this is a tough option. But you could sample students, say, we don't have the resource to bring everyone in, but we could do all the 4th, 7th, and 10th graders, and that would be a way to characterize, how the kids in our district are doing, right? It costs less because there's a lot fewer tests. It reduces overall time. You end up focusing on a few grade levels, but perhaps you don't have to announce that far in advance. And but it does wreaks havoc on growth calculations. Let's say that, and Utah doesn't have very long tests, but if people are concerned about the length of the testing time, you could actually, so Utah uses a computer adaptive test. So matrix sampling is in a case where we break up a test and give each kid a portion of the test. So over a classroom or a school, they all get the whole test and multiple times over. That works with what we call fixed form, where typically every kid would have taken the same test items, but in a CAD or a computer adaptive testing environment, it's already in some sense sort of matrix sampling on steroids. But what you can do is shorten reduce the number of items administered to kids, and so it's you might not be able to get sub-scores, but it might be able to, you might be able to get a much quicker dipstick of how kids are doing. It may, depending on if we do the CAT thing that the shorter test, you could get a student total score, and you could likely use these data in growth calculations because it'll be highly correlated with the previous test. And finally, addressing logistics again. So it's one of the challenges, and again we'll talk about this in the technical advisory committee meeting tomorrow, is the degree to which remote administration can meet large-scale comparability expectations. And why do we care about that? Because if the point is to maintain a trend, we want to be able to compare the results this year with the results in 2019 and 2018. But if in fact it's such a different animal, then if we felt like we couldn't even compare remote to in-person tests this year, how would we use those remote test scores to think about trends over time? So it's just, the point of this is to lay out some of the assessment challenges that we're going to face and ways that we could try to meet those challenges. We have fewer options if we're trying to meet those challenges to be able to support accountability uses. If we're able to forego accountability uses, we have other ways of meeting these challenges that allow us to collect some data to at least get a sense of how kids are doing on a large scale. I'm going to turn this over now. Let's see if there's any questions first before I turn it over to Damien and Leslie. I see some, let me in the chat. So that was a question about...
Yeah, the questions are being addressed. I think the one question that hasn't been addressed is Leanne's question about whether other tests, such as math, show growth that districts used last year are still valid or used.
Yeah, well, it's always a dangerous question to ask me, but it's, you know, there's, again, MAP is claiming that it's able to be administered remotely, and lots of tests. I will tell you that the Utah State tests will be able to be administered remotely as well. And so it's the question of, it's not can we give the test, it's what do we make of the test scores in these remote contexts. So, you know, if it was me and you were in person, I would use the Utah test. I would use the Utah interim and the state summative to focus on measuring growth. Now, if districts used MAP at the end of last year, you know, that might show something, but I don't know. I'm a fan of Utah's tests, and I think that they're better. Others might have different opinions about that. So, all right, without further ado, because I know you know, for the accountability thing, this is one of the things that Darren asked you to weigh in on, is can we, you know, as part of the, so the promise from the legislature was that if we couldn't calculate growth, and this was true for any year, then we would not have to calculate accountability. So now the question is, can we calculate growth, and or should we, is the big question. So Damien or Leslie, who's starting off here?
This is Damien. I'm going to kick it off.
Okay. So just tell me when to advance.
Okay. Thanks, Scott. Hi, I'm not sure I've spoken to all of you before, so let me introduce myself.
I should have introduced you. I'm sorry.
Damien Wiedebenner. I'm a senior associate at the Center for Assessment, work with Scott there, and have worked for about a decade on the student growth analyses that Utah has been implementing. So pretty familiar with everything that's going on there, and hope that this presentation goes some way to addressing questions that you might have and concerns about what's actually possible in 2021 with regard to the calculation of growth. So quickly, the background. Tell my wife sometimes I feel like we're all in sort of a bad B movie or something. Like got a global pandemic going on, schools being interrupted, crazy all around. Education's been basically disrupted worldwide, but as we all know, it's pretty pronounced here in the United States since March 2020. No state summative testing in spring of 2020. And we're pretty unclear about the scope and format of K-12 education in 2021. I live in Massachusetts, and here it's sort of all over the place what students are doing with regard to school based upon local control decisions. And I imagine in Utah and other places it's similarly all over the place. There's also lack of clarity on state summative testing for accountability and in the calculation of student growth. So a lot of what I know now, actually, I probably learned in the last 2 weeks with my daughter going back to school. So there's a lot of that in this presentation. Okay, next slide. So let me just tell you what I'm going to get to at the end here. There are two broad points here. Should states calculate student growth? Yes. And I guess within that, yes, it sort of means that you can calculate it. So barring the complete cancellation of tests in 2021, you will be able to calculate growth, and I recommend that you do it. And I'd say in all the time I've been doing this, which is 2 decades, I'm not sure that there's a more important time to actually have student growth data, and that this growth data can be used in dozens of ways that generally aren't associated with our typical accountability calculations. And I'll go into those here. Second point, should states use student growth for education accountability in 2021? And this, I think, is problematic because to do so, what one has to do is substitute what I'm going to refer to as skip year growth, which is growth from 2019 to 2021 for the usual 1-year growth. And the reason that this substitution is problematic is sort of twofold. One, it's 2-year growth for 1-year growth. And two, the education landscape in 2020, 2021 is, as I sort of mentioned, pretty different than business as usual. So what we're going to see when we dig into some of these results, that those skip year growth and 1-year growth generally line up pretty well. Even under the best of circumstances, it would be contentious to make that substitution. We're clearly not in the best of circumstances. So if you have an option, I say that you don't just run business as usual accountability. Next slide. So give you an overview of today's presentation. Part 1's calculating of skip year, 2-year academic student growth. Then part 2 is using skip year growth for business as usual accountability. And part 3 is using skip year growth for in-depth investigations of the impacts of COVID-19. Next slide. This part 1's the simplest. It's actually pretty straightforward to calculate growth across a 2-year span, and these analyses have been common for years in several states. It's pretty common in several states to calculate, for example, grade 8 to grade 10 growth in particular content areas. And when the course tests are administered, you don't always have students taking tests sequentially from year to year, so you'll calculate growth across the 2-year span. So this has been done a lot. And the mechanisms for doing it, I think, are very well understood. Next slide. So assuming that summative testing occurs as usual in spring 2021, this is fairly routine. So in Utah, the student growth cohorts would be like 3 to 5, 4 to 6, 5 to 7, 6 to 8, 7 to 9, 8 to 10. In science, you'd have 4 to 6, 5 to 7, 6 to 8, 7 to 9, 8 to 10. Interpretation, however, is going to be slightly different because really we're looking at student academic growth across a 2-year span instead of a 1-year span. Though that's pretty, I think, understandable. If people have this notion of sort of 1-year growth, this isn't going to fit neatly into that. One substantial difference is that there won't be growth for 4th graders in ELA and math and 5th graders in science due to the lack of a prior test in 2019. So that's a big issue, as we'll see, particularly when we start trying to roll this up at the school level, because previously schools had growth for those students, and in 2021 they won't. So there would probably, you would expect to see differences due to the absence of those students' growth scores. Next slide. There's several ways that testing might not occur in 2021, so it might get canceled. as it was in 2020. So that's basically makes this all pretty simple. There'd be no skip year growth. Testing might only occur with a non-random subset of the entire population of students. And Scott talked about this a little bit with not population-based testing. And states might be modified to accommodate pandemic-related constraints, so abbreviated forms. And obviously, we might have testing occurring in remote locations and in-person locations. So all of these, if testing occurs, can be accommodated in some ways to get growth, though it's not going to be, as we'll see, sort of perfectly clean. And ultimately, there's a question of just how far it deviates from normal practice to the point where one actually is reluctant to use these values to draw inferences. But we are going to assume that there is some data available just in order to carry out this discussion. So if we've got growth data for, and we want to think about using it for accountability, as Scott mentioned with regard to sort of validation of assessments, we need to carry out some validation exercise to justify the use of skip year growth in lieu of annual growth. And one approach to sort of beginning to support these claims would be to go back and look at some historical data to see how well skip year growth lines up with 1 year growth. And just to give you an example of what's happening in many states, we could go and look at the growth from 2017 to 2019 or 2016 to 2018 and compare that to annual growth from 2018 to 2019 or 2017 to 2018. But key in all of this is that the historical data provides evidence during much different educational circumstances than we have today. So what we're investigating, it's not nothing, but I think it would be a mistake to somehow think that if everything looked great from before, we can go forward full speed ahead now. We clearly have different circumstances now, and these different educational circumstances, which, as Scott mentioned, lead to opportunity to learn concerns, could seriously impact the growth scores, which could undermine business as usual accountability.
Yeah, Damien, wouldn't you say that the skip year growth, like you're talking about, it provides really the ceiling, right? It's the best case scenario. If that's not really comparable, then it can't get any better this year, right?
Correct. Yeah. So in playing this out, if in fact this evidence, we ran these, it showed that skip year growth, it just doesn't line up well with 1 year growth, then that precludes the use of it in good circumstances. We're in not good circumstances now, so it'd be like, yeah, we're definitely not doing it. As you'll sort of see, and as I sort of gave you in the spoiler alert, it lines up pretty well. And as I've said to people on this topic, if you were absolutely in a pinch and forced to come up with some measure of academic growth and we were under normal circumstances, I think you could defend using skip year growth in lieu of 1 year growth. But we're not in those circumstances. And that's why I think the presumption is pretty much that this is not going to work. Ultimately, I think you want to get the 2021 data and look at the results, but I'm fairly confident, given what I've seen with mode effects and things, that you're going to see some rather dramatic, if in fact we get the growth data, dramatic impacts on student learning based upon the mode of instruction that they're associated with. And that in turn completely clouds judgments that you might make about the quality of schools, because schools have circumstances forced on them that really aren't under their control. Next slide. So that's what I just said. Skip year growth doesn't work under standard circumstances, then it should not be used under non-standard current circumstances. But critical in all of this, and I'm presenting a lot of technical stuff, there's a practical side of this that's probably an order of magnitude larger issue than the technical side. And trying to use skip year growth in lieu of 1 year growth probably will lead to a substantial amount of stakeholder pushback. And it's not clear to me whether one wants to burn, if you can avoid it, the stakeholder trust that you actually have to force something like that on people.
So Damien, can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
It seems like, if I'm understanding correctly, you're making a strong case that while we can calculate growth using a skip year model, and we could go back and recalculate skip year models for our students' previous years to look to be able to have some comparability and to understand the variations. It's clear that your position is not advised to use that in an accountability system. However, if we're going to do skip year growth, which at the beginning of your presentation, I think you indicated this year it's an important year to calculate growth, maybe more important than other years that we've had. Are your upcoming slides going to talk about then the advisable way to use that skip year growth? Or is that something you can speak about?
Yes. The last part of this is going beyond accountability. And in a sense, it's once you calculate it, what sort of questions can you address? And to me, some of these questions are huge in terms of policy discussions of what's going on in the state. How do we address this? So yeah, I'll definitely get to that.
Okay, thank you.
So the historical analyses need data from 2017 to 2019 or some other 2-year span just to sort of do this skip year modeling. And the data should provide similarly interpretable results. It's helpful that there hasn't been a change in scale from SAGE to RISE. So that's a plus. The scale change from SAGE to Aspire Plus in high school may require some equating in order to use the results, but I don't think that it's anything that can't be circumvented. Ultimately, norms are easier to apply in this context just because essentially the ground is shifting underneath us and we just want to observe how everyone relates to each other. Next slide. So several states like Utah use a growth to standard model. You can calculate growth to standard targets in 2021 with the skip year. The analysis that follows can be conducted with percentage of students meeting or exceeding their growth target, which is what Utah uses. So either 1 year or skip year. So the way that we're running these analyses and in the discussion allows for the calculations that Utah does.
David, it might just be worth it for some of our newer members to just do a quick, elevator, what growth to standard is.
Yeah, so previously I mentioned sort of norm referencing growth, which in a sense discusses how the student progressed relative to others in the state. Growth to standard tries to answer the question how the growth of the student compares to the growth necessary for them to reach an outcome like proficiency. So norms and criteria are two different ways to look at data. Norms tell you how you're doing relative to others, and the criterion referencing how well you do next to a standard. Both of them are valuable in getting an overall picture of how a student is doing. So norms tell you where you are relative to others. Just because maybe you're at the 70th percentile or doing better than 70% of others doesn't mean in a criterion reference sense that you're doing fantastic. So Utah recognized the need to have both of these in their system, and so that's why there's a growth to standard component in the Utah system.
Right.
Next slide. So why don't I turn this over to my colleague Leslie Kang at this point, and he's going to take you through a set of analyses that he conducted with Utah data, looking at a lot of the different growth data.
Thanks, Damien.
Yeah, thanks, Damien. So yeah, this is Leslie. I work with Scott and Damien. For those who don't know me, and I've been working in Utah for the last years. And yeah, thanks, Damien, for setting the stage. And I just want to acknowledge Damien actually has done this analysis in many states. I think at least 10 states is the last I heard when he presented this previously. And so what we did here is, and the reason I'm presenting is because we were able to take Damien's approach with the SGP and applied it to Utah data. So I had the privilege of working with the Utah data and really just kind of following the script, so to speak, of what Damien has done in many, many other states. And so what I'm presenting here is actually going to be Utah-specific results. Actually, if you're interested in what other states have found, there's actually some presentations on the center's website that you can see. There's a similar presentation like this that you could take a look at. So what we did is there's two types of analysis we did. We did some analysis, first of all, at the individual level. And really, the question we're trying to answer here are really two of them is, if we were going to use 2-year or skip-year growth, SGPs in this case, instead of 1 year, the first question is, would we be systematically excluding any group of students? Right, that's a very practical question to ask. Like, are we, especially if you really are, a specific type of students being eliminated is not getting a growth measure because of this switch from 1 year to 2 year skip growth. And of course, the second question, once you kind of deal with the sample or population issue, then you ask, are you getting similar results if you use 2-year growth versus 1 year growth? And some of these analyses you see, I won't read all of them, but some of the analysis you see under those sub-bullets are the type of analysis we use to kind of get at those particular questions. Next slide, please. Then we go up to the school level and ask, okay, at the school level, then are there specific, what is the impact at the aggregate level? So in the case here, the analysis we looked at is we looked at the mean student growth percentile, which is really the average SGP given at a school for a given test and content area. And of course, the question we're interested in answering there is, how are schools impacted if we were to, if we use 2-year growth versus 1-year growth? And again, are the schools impacted in a way? Are there certain school characteristics about schools that are impacted more than others if we did this? So obviously, this whole idea that Scott was mentioning is, equity is really at the core here. We want to make sure that switching a measure doesn't cause, some inequitable change in how schools get rated based on their growth measure. And again, the statistics that you listed there in the sub-bullets are some of the ones we did to kind of help answer that question. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we conducted this analysis using the most recent Utah data. In Utah, as Damien mentioned, we do have the benefit of having the SAGE program very stable since 2014, which is not something many states could say. So having a test around for 5 or 6 years and the data around for 5 or 6 years is definitely beneficial in this case. As I mentioned earlier, the similar analysis has already been done in several other states in preparation for 2021. So Utah is doing the same right now here as well. So what's going to follow in the next few slides are just some high-level summaries, Sports Center highlights, if you will, of what we found. There's actually some more detailed analysis findings that we're going to share with the Technical Advisory Committee this Friday. And it will include a lot of tables, a lot of numbers that show kind of what we found both at the student and at the school level. And we're going to ask the TAC to provide us with some feedback on these results and the recommendations of potentially using skip-year growth in lieu of one-year growth for accountability. Now, of course, Damien, and I agree with Damien, obviously, in terms of we've already kind of made our position kind of clear with that spoiler alert slide, but it's still, it's interesting to look at the data and get some advisors' feedback on this. And we're actually interested to hear what you have to say about this as well. So next slide, please. So really, to cut to the chase, there's a lot we could go into with the numbers, but ultimately, we're going to actually just talk about it at the accountability at the school level. And this, of course, in this particular case, with the mean growth, student growth percentile results. And again, the question was, are there systematic differences between at the school level between skip year versus 1 year, MGPs in this case? And here's just some highlights to note that in general, if you look at the average overall across all the schools and the standard deviations of the 1 year MGP compared to the skip year MGP, they're actually pretty similar. So on average, overall, there does not seem to be a difference between using skip year versus 1 year at the school level. However, when you look at individual schools, though, it does vary significantly. One rule of thumb that Damien has used in terms of what would be considered a significant change in terms of your mean student growth percentile is a value of 5. So if you, for instance, had an MGP of, say, 45, and it went down to 40, we would consider that a pretty significant change. Or if you went the other way and went up to 50, that would be a significant change as well. So we kind of use that rule of thumb of 5 as kind of a threshold, if you will. And we did notice, actually, when you use skip year MGP versus 1 year MGP, had somebody used skip year MGPs in 2019 instead of the 1 year MGP, many schools would actually have had pretty significant swings in their MGP scores. And so many of them had an absolute difference greater than 5. And this especially stood out for mathematics, where there was even more, where the swing was even more prominent across schools. And we don't actually have an explanation for that. This is simply what the data are telling us. But it did seem like math was more effective than in science and ELA, for instance. Now, we did do some correlation. We did also, to answer the systematic difference part, we looked at we compared the difference between skip year and 1 year MGPs and correlated that with several school characteristics, including the average school achievement, percentage of ELLs in a school, the percentage of students with free and reduced lunch or low SES, and the percentage of special ed students. And there was no discernible pattern there. So at least it wasn't systematic at the school level. It just, so basically if the difference does seem to be spread across all the different types of schools. Next slide, please.
And Leslie, I think it's fair, just as a reminder to folks, when you do this skip year growth, Damien pointed it out, is that when we do skip year growth, we can't measure the growth of fourth graders because there was no second grade test. So
correct.
Yeah. And so the overlap of like a typical grades 3 through 5 school or 3 through 6 school is real. Even in regular year growth, right? In a typical elementary school, the fifth graders are gone, and then you get new third graders or third graders, which then move up to fourth grade in a regular 1 year situation. But now in this 2 year situation, you have almost a complete turnover of kids that would count in your growth calculations. And that, it just could be simply that, is that you're just evaluating the growth of just very different kids, even in these perfect conditions. So.
Yeah. Thanks for that clarification. Indeed, yeah. These results don't include any, anybody from the fourth grade in math and ELA and fifth grade in science. Because science actually, that's helpful. You don't even have a third grade test in that case. So yes. Next slide. So here's some of the bottom line results. And again, there's a lot more details we could have gone into, and I guess those interested, we're happy to share the actual detailed results. But The bottom line is the absolute differences that we're seeing in the MGPs for schools are likely large enough to change accountability growth scores for schools. So really, and again, I guess we can't stress this enough. This is under pre-COVID conditions because we're only looking at data from 2019. As Damien has really, clearly articulated, we have no idea how this is going to play out in 2021. All that we can probably speculate is probably going to be even more serious or worse. So as such, we do have reservations about using skip year growth in place of 1 year growth in 2021. And again, Damien's done a really good job at illustrating why this is why we feel this way. If it's already like this under quote normal conditions, one can only imagine what it'll be like in the post-COVID world. Next slide. So really, that doesn't mean we stop though. And what I'm doing here now is just going to tee this up for Damien as he kind of gets into this the idea of, well, we still recommend calculating growth, including skip year growth, but what can it be used for? And this is what Darren was asking earlier. So the recommendation here is that Utah should still plan on calculating skip year growth in 2021. And it would be good to compare this with 2019 skip year results, just as an effort to try to understand what's going on, and potentially there's still a decision to be made about whether it should be used for accountability. Now, the one thing I should mention, though, is that remember, and I'm not sure how many people are aware of this, but the mean growth, the MGPs, the mean student growth percentiles that we've been using in this analysis are actually not used in the Utah accountability system. It's kind of a nice proxy to look at. But in the actual accountability system, there's actually, as Damien was illustrating here, it is a growth to target model where there are individual adequate growth percentile targets that students have to meet, and then you aggregate at the school level how many students met their targets. So MGPs are not actually used. So it would be actually beneficial to kind of play this out, even do an impact analysis, if you will, to see how it would play out in the accountability system if you had used skip year growth. So that's something, a further analysis that may be worthwhile. But I think the most important point is this last bullet, is that it is important to compute skip year growth in 2021 and compare it to 2019 because it could help us better understand the impact of the pandemic on student learning, which, as Damien said, if there was a time that growth analyses and all the stuff that we do in measurement is important, now would be the time because it is key to helping us understand how students have been affected. And so this is talking about use beyond accountability, and I'll actually now turn over back to Damien to address that usage.
Yeah, so what I'm going to outline here, this going beyond accountability, is an idea that my advisor Bob Lynn discussed. It's been two decades ago, but it's sort of written in this quote where really saying that we can use data from accountability systems beyond just making causal inferences about school quality. And using the results as descriptive information, we can use them as sort of this beginning of fact-finding to try to dig deeper, particularly when we see problematic disparities. So I'm going to be laying out how the calculation of growth and the use of the growth percentiles can assist Utah in really quickly answering some very important questions in 2021. Next slide. So sort of two important investigative tracks here. One is to investigate sort of differential impact on student learning for various student groups. And I'll sort of spell out the different student groups. And then the other is sort of a more overall comprehensive view of what the impact on student learning is for the whole state and for various student groups. Next slide. So how is this done? It's actually done very easily. So when one calculates growth using SGP methodology, one of the axioms of it is because it's a norm, if you were to take all of the students' SGPs and calculate the median or the mean of them, what you end up with is the number 50, because the percentiles range from 1 to 99. What one can then do is realize that if you were to randomly select students from the population and just calculate their mean or their median, it's going to be close to 50. When we go in and start looking at the mean or median of particular subgroups, what we end up finding is growth gaps. And these growth gaps are looked at throughout all of these states, where you see how the socioeconomically disadvantaged students do versus non-socioeconomically disadvantaged. How English language learner students do versus non-English language learner. And how, say, different ethnic groups do relative to one another. And differences in that essentially sort of are looking at growth gaps. And essentially what it's sort of saying is that one group's learning is more or less impressive than another group's learning. And it doesn't say why, but when those growth gaps are large, it becomes the beginning of an investigation as to why. So a critical component of this is to go and start looking at different groups. So I think that there's standard groups that we generally look at, and those I've mentioned are ethnicity, socioeconomic status, special education status, ELL status. Some other ones that I think are super critical, given that we're in the midst of a pandemic, is to try to investigate growth gaps between students receiving different types of education programs during the pandemic. What this critically requires is that we have the data on what type of education program students are receiving. Are they remote? Are they hybrid? Are they in person? And clearly these aren't static categories, they're changing. So having some sense of how much of each one of these students are receiving, perhaps there are certain schools that have done things, we can actually go in and investigate whether or not, for example, remote learning is producing the same type of gains that we would see with in-person. Based upon work that I've done over the years that looks at this at the high school level, I can say with great confidence that virtual high schools generally produce very impoverished student growth. I don't know what the situation is going to necessarily be for elementary and middle school students, but my inclination is to say that remote is not going to be as good as in person. How much worse, I don't know. And maybe there's a chance that it's better, but ultimately seeing what these different types of gaps look like will be critical. Also, I suspect that not all remote learning is created equal. And there may be some places, schools that have implemented remote learning in a very vibrant way that actually produces impressive learning gains, whereas in other places it doesn't. So once you have these grouping variables, it's as simple as calculating the average of the SGPs for the students in that group and then comparing it to other groups in contrast and looking for differences. And large differences likely signal an important causal mechanism in place there that one can go in and start looking at more deeply. One aspect of this that I think probably won't work with regard to timing, but I think would be ideal, is that if in fact the growth values could be calculated before summer, If you were to calculate them for students and you end up finding a significant portion of students have taken a plunge, then this is indicative of the fact that they haven't learned as much as we expected them to learn. And to try to come in and address those learning losses in some ways, not necessarily through repeating grades or traditional remediation, but in some ways trying to recognize that students have fallen off a cliff academically, and we need to come in and try to address that. One way that's sort of critical about how this is done that I want to sort of recognize is that I mentioned that growth analyses are norm referenced. Well, one thing that I think will be critical to do is to use previous two-year norms on this 2019 to 2021 skip year. By using those norms as baselines, what we'll be able to do is quantify the two-year growth of students based upon what two-year growth used to look like in the state of Utah. And that will give the state a sense of just how much learning has slowed down in the 2019 to 2021 span relative to what two-year growth used to look like. And that will be critical, I think, in recognizing just how deep of a hole the students in the state are in.
David, could you say more about how you would baseline that against it's a different methodology? Because if the cohort reference is every year is 50, so how would you compare the growth in 21, let's say, against a skip year that was 2016 to 2018 or something like that?
It's all a sense of just using norms at different times. As Scott mentioned, usually the norms that we use are the freshest available. Since we have all of this data available in the current year, we create the norms in real time. However, nothing prevents us from using older norms if we want to. And this is essentially what's done when you go into your pediatrician with your child and look at the height and weight charts. Those norms for height and weight are not sort of for kids in the current year. Oftentimes they're 10 years old, maybe 15 years old. So the state actually has historical two-year growth norms from 2016 to 2018 and 2017 to 2019. Those can be utilized to look at the growth of kids across this 2019 to 2021 span in light of what we would say sort of normal circumstances. Under normal circumstances, that norm mean is going to be 50. So supposing that these non-normal circumstances lead to diminished learning, the mean for the state would be less than 50. And the question is sort of like how much less? Let's say it's 45. Then as Leslie pointed out, that corresponds to an effect size of 0.18, which in education and research terms is sort of considered a smallish impact. If it's 40, then the effect size would be 0.36, 2 times 0.18, and we're starting to get into the medium effect size range. We start seeing means of 30. I mean, that's when we start recognizing that a Katrina, so to speak, has hit the state and has just completely tipped over the whole educational system. And you have 4 times 0.18, you've got something like, what would that be, 0.72, which is a large effect size. So you're talking, really big impacts on student learning that just don't go away by sort of pushing kids along and saying it'll be all right. But it's critical to sort of know that number. And that number will sort of let you know just like how big of a hole has been dug. And I don't know the answer. So back to the spoiler again. Should you calculate it? Yes. And it's pretty standard how it can be done. Scott even brought up this notion of maybe sampling. If you just sort of have a sample of students, that wouldn't preclude you from running those students through baseline growth norms to come up with a sort of a mean for the state. If it's not a random sample, then it becomes difficult to start making generalizations to the state level or to the school, but there would be a way to calculate growth in that sense using the baseline norms. For accountability purposes, I would say you want to be supremely cautious about this and try to promote more beneficial uses of the data if you can. And I tried to lay out some of those more beneficial uses. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer those.
Yeah, if anybody, folks have questions? Damien, clarifications?
This is board.
Go ahead.
This is board member Earl. Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear, Jenny.
Okay. It just still says it's muted. So sorry, or at least on my computer. I just have a couple of comments. I am concerned about us doing too much sampling. I can see, but doing too much this year. I just see this as another stressful thing for our educators in a time of, I would say complete chaos. I don't know that it's complete chaos, but even Davis School District is going back to 4 days soon, right? So there's this continual change, and I don't know how we adequately measure for that in a way that's going to be interpretable for people down the road. In other words, we can come up with statistics that, for the skip year or whatever, but it really doesn't account for the changes and everything. And I would hate to put more, I just have concerns about putting additional pressure on our administrators and our educators. So how do we do that in a way that we are not creating, does that make sense? We're not creating that additional pressure in our system that goes beyond a real expectation. It's, we're not forcing into more of a transactional type of a thing versus a relationship type of thing where we're trying to work with educators. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, board member. Okay, Damien, you respond.
Yeah, so one quick distinction that I like to make with regard to this is often the data that gets generated from tests that's used for accountability is perceived sort of as a hammer. And I always like to promote the data as being a flashlight. And as hard as you try to convince the principals and stuff that this is a flashlight, it often looks like a hammer. So my goal in this year is I think there's an opportunity here to try to step back and provide the data as a flashlight that can help the state as well as local stakeholders better understand what happened. And to, if in fact something dramatically bad to student learning appears to have happened, to try to, as best as possible, identify what the causal mechanism is and think about, say, not doing that if at all possible. The 4 days a week one is quite interesting to me because I can see the necessity of trying to go to that mode and having the benefits of it, then trying to understand whether or not it may have actually benefited students to do that, but to go in and try to use the data to investigate that.
Board member Earls, that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's nice theoretically to say that. The reality is it is a hammer So we can, I agree with you. It should only be that flashlight, focusing on those areas of need. There'd be a lot more that needs to be reworked in the state of Utah, probably federally, for it to not be the hammer. So that's where it gets a little messy, right? So anyway, thank you for your comments. Appreciate it.
Just so that AAPAC members know, we're eventually going to move to a recommendation on this one way or the other, but we want people to weigh in now. Who has comments or questions?
Hello.
Hi.
So this is Brent.
Sorry.
I'm very interested in the information that we can learn on student growth that we could gather this upcoming spring. I'd like to consider something else as well. What about in 2021-22, giving the assessment twice, once at the beginning of the year and once at the end of the year, and calculating the growth for that year that way. And also, that would give teachers a lot of data that then they could look at how they could work through that in their curriculum during the course of that school year.
So that's a slightly different suggestion, Brent, but that's okay. You're the only one sitting in the classroom, so you get extra points for that. But I do think that we don't need to give the same assessment, the same full-on state assessment at the beginning of the year, and at the end of the year, we could calculate growth using the interim assessments to the summative assessment. So it's not necessary to give take all the time to give the full state test. It's not really designed as a beginning of year measure. And if we just cared about growth, there's less intrusive ways to do it.
All right.
Other members of Hal, you've been popping stuff in the chat, and Ashley I know has. Other members want to weigh in?
Can I make a comment?
Yeah, go ahead, Hal.
Okay, thanks everybody. I really worry about any calculations right now. I guess I'll do the counter. I'll give you a really counter crazy option that will probably never occur. And that is if we use 2019-20 as a clean year in assessment, that we need another clean year before we can really get back to our more quote unquote normal interpretations. And that's not going to be this year. We're not doing smooth sailing at all right now. So I would say that this year is on track to be like last year. And until we get a fall where we have a clean opening and a full school year, then I could look at a clean baseline, and then I could look at a clean whatever type of growth or other stuff. But right now, I still think we're in a Katrina. I have a high school that we just closed down, and we've pushed everybody to online. And I could argue that it's going to be ebbing and flowing throughout the state, but we have a district that can't even fully open. We have kids that are doing packet learning, and then we have kids that are on high-speed internet rolling along. I just think that my ideal of what a normal year would look like is where we could get back to clean calculations. And so it's just a general comment of all of this makes me nervous because the interpretations, I worry that we're going to do a Rorschach test and we're going to put out the result and everybody's going to bring their background knowledge and their concerns and hypotheses about learning in students, and they're going to all interpret it the way they want to interpret it because it's going to be so muddled. So just contrarian idea.
Yeah, not that contrarian. But Steve, I think, has a different point of view raised in the chat. Steve, I don't know if you want to unmute and ask it or you want me just to read it. I think it's a good question that we should address. I don't know if he's able to unmute. So I'll ask it while he's maybe struggling to unmute. Steve asks, could you clarify why the skip year growth being used for accountability is not being recommended if all schools in Utah experience the same pandemic influences. I'll just get somebody want to weigh in on that.
So this is Damien. I would say let's suppose that plays out and that there's sort of this uniform pandemic influence. One of the calculations that I hope to sort of see as soon as 2021 data is available is to look at that skip year growth, and we can do that sort of in a norm reference sense, and compare, say, the gaps that we see there with what we saw sort of previously with 2-year growth.
And gaps, you mean like student group gaps? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, student group gaps, spread at the school level, things like that. And let's just suppose that it lines up pretty well. Then what that sort of suggests is that, say, the uniform effects of the pandemic are such that we're still roughly in a business as usual situation in terms of things. So it then takes it back to this situation of where even in business as usual, it's a little bit of a stretch to sort of use the skip year, but I think if you're in a pinch, you can. So then that would be my recommendation, is that if the feds come along and say, no, you have to do accountability and all of these things, then, and if you end up showing that there's no sort of, or that the uniform effects have led to no appreciable changes in what you saw previously with 2 years, then you could probably go ahead. I think that is likely a remote, there's a remote chance of that happening, but right. Ultimately run the numbers in 2021 and make an empirical investigation of it.
Yeah, and I think we see in the chat, several folks have pointed out that schools and districts are all over the board, and I think, Steve, that's the biggest challenge is, schools are not all experiencing the same pandemic. If you look at some of your most rural schools compared to your more urban and heavily suburban settings, I think the impact is very different, and impact where kids have internet access versus where they don't. So I think that's the challenge. I think assuming that everybody's experiencing the same pandemic is a challenge. So Darren put something in the chat that I think is important. So just so you're clear about this, folks, the U.S. Department of Ed, as people have seen the Betsy DeVos letter likely that says that, you got to test next year. She left open the possibility of, didn't close off the possibility of an accountability waiver. And I think all's going to change after November, no matter how the election changes, turns out, because as we see an uptick in cases. So the question that Darren has there, should the state board pursue an addendum, that's the federal speak, an amendment to the accountability waiver, if available, to the 2020 accountability waiver to address these challenges. And this is, this one's specific to the growth calculation. So what is the AAPAC's view on that?
I have a question. This is Board Member Earl. Does it have to be a standardized assessment, so to speak, that everyone takes, or can an LEA report to us based on the assessments and measurement tools they're using as to the growth of students? Does it have to be I understand that's what you guys do, but I'm just asking if it has to be that, or can we rely on the locals to make those decisions based on the things they're doing? I mean, these are educational professionals that we are relying on to teach the kids each day. Could they not assist us in gathering this data from their perspective or from their, anyways?
Yeah, Board Member Earl, that was, I don't know if you missed, that was part of my earlier presentation. If we're willing to forego formal accountability, and we found it very hard to do a statewide test, then sure, maybe pushing the responsibility to the locals is a way to at least get some data, but those data can't be used in accountability purposes because they won't be comparable, not even close. So that would be, a last, not even last resort, but it'd be a resort if we clearly had given up on growth and clearly had given up on the potential for statewide assessment.
But wouldn't it, I understand, but wouldn't it be more accurate in that it wouldn't be comparable from district to district because they're going to be different?
Right.
As far as the student, not the overall system, as far as the student. So that I just wonder if there's a more accurate measurement based on letting the teachers make those calls instead of a state assessment that the feds are mandating.
Just to put my cards on the table, I'm straight with you, is I would question the quote unquote accuracy of those data because I'm not questioning teachers. I love teachers, serve on school boards, but the quality of those data will be suspect. And certainly for any use besides helping inform local instruction, which is a very important use, but it's not necessarily the use we're talking about directing resources or monitoring programs or things like that. So people should disagree with me if they want.
Can I add in a comment, Scott?
Yeah, go ahead, Hal.
So my district, so we're suburban, but we have a variety of learning options that we've provided parents. And we're having differential effects on attendance, and then whatever we're calling engagement across the online spectrum, we don't have a really good handle about what engagement or attendance looks like through an online. We have about 20% of our students doing that. So I'm kind of going back. My very foundation of what sitting in class looks like and learning looks like, I can't even quantify that piece of it. So I don't mind getting test data for interpretation, but I'm still struggling with my interpretations of test data, let alone accountability, because of all these differential effects of a kid barely logging in, and yet they look good on paper, but they really haven't logged in. And so I just add that perspective. When we have people, we don't know what engagements and accountability or attendance looks like, or an equivalent of attendance online. And I know that many other states are struggling with these ideas, but yeah. I feel like we're in the middle of struggling with that.
Yeah. Hal, can I respond to that? So I think someday in the future, in the coming days, you'll probably be asked by your local board or other leadership within your organization, what's the impact of that been? Mm-hmm. Has the blended learning, has the back and forth learning, has that worked the way that we thought it would work? Is face-to-face still the best way for our students to learn and to engage the education system? And I think we need to look forward and think when those questions come to us, how are we going to respond to that? What do we need to have collected in order for us to be able to answer those questions as well as we can, understanding there's certainly limitations on the quality of the data that we have, especially, to your point, how when we get to testing, let's assume the spring of 21 is similar to today across the state. I think it would be reasonable to expect we'll have a lower participation rate of students in any assessment that we offer, including local assessments that you might want students to take in Canyon's district or for the rest of our community members in your own districts. So I think as we will move into the accountability discussion next, but I'd like some guidance to take back to the board around this growth calculation. Again, assuming, remember the first of the slides, there's an assumption that in the spring of 21, we will be administering statewide assessments. And if that assumption isn't true, then our discussion today is mute to some point.
Right.
We're moving forward as though that assumption will come to pass. And if it does, what manner should we calculate growth? Should we attempt to calculate growth? And if so, what manner should we use? I think the center has made the proposal that we use the skipped year growth method.
But not for accountability, we want to say.
But not for accountability. So this particular item that I'd like some direction from the AAPAC group, the voting members, to give input and allow me to take that back to the board in October is how should USB approach measuring student growth in 2021? And then in that I also have in subsequent years, because to your point, Hal, it might be very well that a year from now we still need to use a different method for calculating growth, or we might need to start a new baseline for growth calculations in the state of Utah, which we haven't talked about that specifically yet. But I'm really interested in our APAC members to give us. I have a draft motion that I thought, listening to the presentation by Damien, I thought, well, maybe this would be something the committee would want. I didn't want to throw that in the chat line until committee members, though, were able to share your opinions and maybe help me reframe that before I share it, or I could share it now and then you guys could cut it apart. And
I have a question.
Yes.
Can you hear me? This is Sarah Jones.
Yes, Sarah. Go ahead, Sarah.
So my question is kind of the backward mapping of your time frame, not knowing what spring testing will look like, not knowing what rolling closures of schools will look like. We're the first couple of weeks into school, and I hear Darren saying he'd like to start in October advising the board, but what really is the time frame you need to work on? Because it feels premature to me to be making decisions not yet knowing how the school year is going to unfold, that maybe I'm not understanding the time it takes to actually put into place all of these systems. So can someone talk a little bit about that?
yeah, let me try to.
Again, yeah.
You can jump in from your perspective of working with other states and also the federal government. When we start talking about, I'll break it apart. Let's talk about the growth calculation first. You can see that there's modeling that we need to conduct internally if the decision is made to move forward with using skip year growth. Leslie did some basic analysis, but we would need to internally allocate staff resources to do that. First of all, the board would need to consider the recommendation and direct staff to do that, and that could happen. That process typically goes through a committee first, then to the full board, and if it's a smooth sailing, that's 2 months. And then you have staff then that needs to be allocated resources to be able to conduct the work that they need to do and then implement the changes. If we talk about accountability, especially the next item we're going to discuss, the addendum potentially, again, that goes through the board as well. They would consider it and direct staff. So that could take several months. You have a public period where public comment needs to be gathered, and then you would submit that to the federal government. So in terms of the addendum, we're about on the timeline we would need to be. In fact, probably some states might have already acted on that. Just because of the amount of time it takes to do some of those things. The next two items that I'll seek action for, again, then maybe not as time sensitive, but our group isn't scheduled to meet again till February. We could schedule additional meeting earlier as needed to be able to inform and direct the board or advise the board. But I can appreciate the concerns there, but there are some constraints from my perspective and my role that delaying it does create some challenges that then become harder to address. So it's an effort to try to be as proactive as possible. And again, you're right, we don't know what the spring of 21 will look like, if things will have calmed down substantially within our instructional environments and stabilized, and all of the things in our communities that would need to be put in place for that to happen, or if we'll continue to see the same level of disruption or even increased disruption. So again, we're making assumptions and preparing for If we're able to test, what steps should we take? If we're not able to test, then there would be some more reactionary actions we would need to take.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, Darren, just to Sarah's point, and Sarah, I appreciate that. The thing is, your question really before you right now is, do you feel like you know enough based on Damien and Leslie's presentation about the best case scenario of skip year growth, and knowing what you know now about the current situation? Do you feel like is the AAPAC willing to recommend to the board to not calculate growth for accountability next year? Or you could recommend wait and see. Then makes things tougher, but that's feasible. You could say, we don't know, maybe by some miracle everybody will be in schools from February through May, and we could test these kids. I would feel confident. It still would be a skip year growth though. So that's really the question. Does that help, Sarah?
That was really helpful. Thank you both.
Okay. Yeah. The one thing I forgot to mention was we also have statutory requirements. The legislature through special sessions waived a lot of those requirements, all the ones that the board requested back in 20. So through the 20 school year, if we find ourselves in a position that we are recommending not to move forward with accountability, or not to move forward with any of those other statutory requirements, which include, publishing results and reports, then we also have to take action, ideally before the legislative session, which starts in January, so they can address that during a regularly scheduled legislative process, because we can't depend on special sessions to be available to us.
Darren and Scott, this is Rich and Ogden. I apologize. Every time I type in a comment and hit enter, it disappears. So Scott, I need you to stop blocking my comments.
I'm the one erasing them. That's what's happening, Rich.
Anyway, for giving the conversation, I would support calculating skip year growth to provide what has been described, an understanding of how these different effects, i.e. school dismissal, school disruptions, blended learning models, et cetera, have for all students generally, but it also shines a line on specific student groups and allows us some actionable information. So while I support that, I think that it could also inform, depending on the results of going through that effort. Again, that's based on the assumption that we're administering assessments this spring, and we'll have that data to calculate that skip year growth. But I could support it because I believe, depending on the outcome of that data, as understood correctly, could have significant implications on future statute, board rule, resource allocation, et cetera, et cetera. I would also support an addendum to the Department of Education from accountability requirements as appropriate. So my two cents. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's helpful, Rich. Thank you. Other folks, this is an important time. This is an important decision, so don't hold back.
This is Board Member Earl.
Yes.
If it's something that AAPAC wants to recommend, I would actually recommend we did sampling, so then there's less chance it's not used as a hammer, so to speak, that it is used in the way that would be appropriate. So I would recommend that over
yeah. So Board Member Earl, I mean, that's really an assessment question, and this is really just about assuming we get any data, should we calculate growth for accountability?
So I thought this would be combined with that.
Yeah, I think it's cleaner for everyone if we don't, because that's the assessment stuff is stuff is going to be based on other discussions. But
okay, I'm not for doing the growth this year.
Okay, for accountability.
Yes.
Okay.
This is Brent. I would second Superintendent Nye's suggestions.
Thanks, Brent.
Hi, this is Christy. Can you hear me, Scott?
Yes, Christy, go ahead.
So it's difficult, I represent, the school boards across our state. And as all of you know, we're at different stages. You know, everybody is.
Yeah.
You know, my local board is Salt Lake, and we're in complete remote. You know, and going all over the state, looking at how different the delivery of education is right now. And my concern, I'm tending to lean towards, you know, Board Member Earl, but understand, you know, I'm so glad that Superintendent and I, you know, piped in. But my concern is that it's such a vast, different way that remote and in-person is being handled across our state, even though our educators are professionals. You know, it's been interesting for me to see the difference in my own little in Salt Lake District, you know, in the last couple of days. So I'm hesitant, you know, to move forward with growth. But at the same time, I also believe that if we don't have some kind of measurement, then where does that leave us? Does it lag us behind even further? And to a certain extent, I think that the hammer obviously is not the way I want to go, but I do want us to be able to have some sort of benchmarks.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm on the fence right now, Scott. I'm having a difficult time, you know, of trying to decide where I want to vote with this. And so I know my teaching and learning director, Tiffany Hall, is on the line right now. And I just would really appreciate to hear from our other superintendents that are online right now. I think that it would be helpful. And
Christy, let me just clarify. It's the question is not whether or not to calculate growth. The question is whether or not to use it for accountability.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah, I understand that. So, okay, thanks.
And I promised to be Steve's voice. He doesn't have a mic today. So Steve says, I support the idea of skip year growth calculations to be used, to be given to schools and districts, but not to be used for accountability. And Sherry seconds Steve's idea. So I don't know if that...
Can I ask a clarification?
Please.
So that's for this current year. I get the idea. Here's where I'm at. My teachers are struggling with trying to do what they have in front of them.
Yeah.
And my worry is that it goes to the board and they say that this is what we're going to do, not for accountability. But I worry if it gets out in the wrong way to the media, then teachers read in the next few weeks that growth is being calculated and the teacher's going, holy cow, I'm just trying to hold it together. I feel like they're being unresponsive to my current plight of where I'm trying to do. And they're coming across as cold-hearted with this. And so maybe it's the messaging around it, but I just really hesitate a message that could get out to say that we are not completely empathetic of the challenges that teachers are overloaded trying to do multiple ways of teaching online and in person or all of these factors. So that's why I said if we could push it back, but I worry that the messaging will come across as uncaring towards teachers right now. So that's my...
So let me, Darren, maybe this, because I think the key question that we need answered today is, do people feel like we should calculate growth for accountability? I don't think we need to answer the second question of should we calculate growth at all right now. And perhaps Hal's right, because, you know, we don't have any data to calculate it anyway right now. And so we could make that decision in February, because if it's not, you know, it's the accountability decision that has the more statutory and regulatory implications. The calculating for use for districts could be pushed out. So maybe it'd be simpler for us if we just ask, is anybody in favor of calculating growth for accountability purposes based on what you know now for the 2020-2021 school year? Darren, is that makes sense to you, framing it that way?
Yeah.
Okay.
That would help us move forward as well.
Right.
So I appreciate that, narrowing that down.
So is anybody, there's a chance to speak up. Is anybody in favor of calculating growth, based on what you know now, calculating skip year growth for accountability?
No.
I knew that, Brent.
So what happens statutorily because of the requirement of that? I don't support it in any way, but what happens to us statutorily? What has to be done for accountability measures through the state law?
So Darren, I'll leave that to you. This will go as a recommendation to the board, but go ahead, Darren.
Yeah, I don't have the specific statutes in front of me, but it would require requesting and the state legislature granting reprieve from the requirements around school accountability and other associated accountability related statutes, including turnaround, and there's other programs. In addition, would require the state board to request and receive reprieve from federal requirements related to accountability, which I think you've done a
So
good
would it
job.
be much like we did this year with Senate bill, with Senator Henderson's bill that allowed us to not?
Well, that's just over. Yeah, that's a great question. That was for overall school ratings. We still were on a path for school accountability, meaning deliver all the assessments, determine the indicator level ratings, publish that, use that data to identify schools in need of turnaround, and also to exit schools from turnaround. It's more like what we would need, like what happened in the special session where they granted a reprieve from a long list of items, and the federal government in their waiver, one-page waiver that included a list of things that they didn't expect states to need to do. Again, we don't expect the federal government to allow carte blanche waivers on assessment delivery across the country. And I'm not sure, there's no reason that I have to believe that we would expect that at the state level to waive assessment requirements. Obviously, that's my personal opinion only. Accountability becomes actually the more sensitive topic from my perspective anyway. It seems to me that whether I'm wearing my parent hat or whether I'm going back in time and putting my principal hat or district administrator hat, having data around the impacts that soft closures, blended learning, online learning has had on my students, my own child, if we're looking at it through that lens, or a system is really important to me this year, maybe more than ever before, because I have more concerns this year about the delivery of educational service to my child than I have previous years where I just had a comfort zone and I didn't worry that much about what data elements are available for me to measure the quality of the services that my children have been receiving. So I don't know if that helps answer the question or not. There's a little personal narrative in there.
Yeah. So Darren, I don't think there's anyone on. If they are, they're not voting. They're not going to the polls. Who's in favor of calculating skip year growth for accountability? And I think that's the motion you need. And who asked that? Leanne asked that question about the process, right? Where it's the one of the A's in our name is advisory committee, and so we advise the board. We're not rulemaking, and the board takes it from there, and then they work with the legislature. This is Scott's opinion. I believe there will be federal waivers in some way, shape, or form, and so we'll see. Again, we don't know that right now, but we'll see how that plays out. So, Darren, I think we could move on. I think we have our answer. Again, if anybody disagrees with that, nobody's gonna. It's a friendly bunch. You don't have to worry about saying something different.
Yeah, in my report to the board, I'll include that the vote was unanimous for the members, the AAPAC voting members that were present.
Can you state exactly what that was again? Because I feel like it's changed a couple times. What is it we're saying yes to or no to specifically?
So the AAPAC is recommending that the board not require the calculation of skip year growth for school accountability in 2021.
Okay, thank you.
I know there's a few too many negatives in there, but we'll get the idea, I think. So. Okay, so we're a little behind schedule, as you could tell. So let's make this break really quick. I have like 5 minutes to 3 Mountain Time. So if people could just try to get back as close to 3 as possible, and we'll continue on. We'll do our best. So let's come back at 3 if we can. All right, so don't anybody log off, leave your machines on. You could just mute yourself if you want to. Thanks, folks. So Darren was really wise to rearrange the agenda and to get to the key questions. So we're going to move now to this accountability, implications for accountability. And I can't remember who's presenting this, so it might be me. I don't know if it's Anne Michelle or is it me, but there's or Darren. So well, I could start. So there's several issues, folks, that we have to talk about. Some of these implications based on the assessment and accountability context, right? We sort of talked about these first 2 bullets already. We're talking about collecting opportunity to learn data. I know that's me. And then impact on trend, and then these other implications that Darren raised in the beginning that were brought to us by the assessment directors, local assessment directors group. So I'm going to get us started here. I think we actually already we discussed this. We got the answer that we that we needed. I think we said it's too soon to deal with much more than this question of growth. So I want to just keep us moving because we really discussed this. And then, I don't know, Darren, if you got direction on applying for this federal waiver. There is no, people should be clear, there is no waiver there yet. We don't have one to apply for. It's in anticipation of that waiver. And I don't know how you want to take that.
Scott, maybe you can help. There's some of the national calls that I've been on. I've talked about, I think they were CCSSO events where they talked about that they not to expect waivers, but the federal government, the Department of Education, U.S. Department of Education has received addendums to their state ESSA plans. Mm-hmm. And if I recall right, their direction was that they didn't anticipate just waiving requirements, but addendums to show how states would then measure and make determinations about accountability would be more highly favorable. And that's, I guess, questions that I still have in my mind is this difference between the addendum to your ESSA plan versus the waiver, which according to at least the few calls I've been on, not to expect waivers, certainly for assessment, but even for accountability, the conversations seem to center on updating the state's ESSA plan and highlighting how states then would use the available data to make determinations about accountability.
Yeah, I think all of us are a little confused at this point what the feds are going to allow or not allow. I don't think the feds know what they're going to allow and not allow. I do know that as part of our the 2 federal groups, the groups that Darren mentioned, the Council of Chief State School Officers, has these 2 working groups. One focuses on assessments, a lot of working groups, 2 that I'm closest to. One relates to accountability systems and one relates to assessment systems. Utah has members in both. I know that we've invited and they've accepted a team from the U.S. Department, that's coming up in October, a team from the U.S. Department of Ed to do a joint session with the Accountability and Assessment Directors Group. I suspect we won't get much more clarity about this notion of an addendum there. And, I don't know, because Utah would then, if in fact you had to go forward with accountability, at least federal accountability, without using growth based on what we just said, that's a very different accountability system. So I don't know how, I think we would just have to try to propose not, making new designations of comprehensive school support improvement or targeted support improvement. I don't know if that would fly. Others should weigh in who might know. And Michelle, I don't know if you've been in different conversations.
Yeah, I was actually just typing something into the chat. My understanding is that the addendum is intended for states to be able to define any changes to their normal operations in accountability and potentially an assessment for this 1 year, 2020, 2021. It's a way for us to describe how we are going to do things differently for this year. Typically, changes to our ESSA plan would require an amendment, and that's a permanent change. And so to avoid making an amendment to the plan and then amending it back to a status quo, this addendum is sort of a stopgap way of addressing any changes that need to take place. That's what I have gathered.
That makes sense. Yeah, so the question then becomes, what kind of changes do we want to make? And I think that's, Darren, I think that maybe is too broad for this group now. I think that I certainly welcome ideas, but I think it would require USBE, perhaps with us and the TAC, to really formulate a plan. And I think we have to get closer to see what data we'll even have available.
It was during the summer, and I expect that this might change, but in the presentation from staff from the
Right.
Department of Education, they said that they were putting kind of a December 30th submission date on being able to respond to waivers within 30 or 60 days or something like that.
Right.
But I think that might change because we don't, like we've said, there's just so many unforeseen circumstances that we might encounter.
Right. So, Darren, I know that I was thinking about this in a different way. Thought we might have more information by the time of this meeting, but we haven't gotten any more information from the feds. So I'm not sure what to do with this item now, since we haven't really announced. I haven't seen any formal announcement for these addenda. Have you, Michelle? It's just people talking about it. I haven't seen anything.
This is Board Member Earl. I just have a question on this.
Yeah.
Do we have to wait for them to tell us that we can make an addendum, or can we do that? Can we initiate something? I'm not saying we jump the gun on this. All I'm saying is that, is this something we can do, or do we have to have their approval to even decide to do this? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So like Anne Michelle said, the state can choose to amend its accountability system, federal accountability system, anytime it wants. You have to get approval to do that. You can't just do it. And so in this case, you certainly could go through that process. But what Anne Michelle said, which is smart, if you did that, then now you have a changed plan going forward, and then you'd have to go through the whole amendment process to change it back. What we're hoping to get is a much more streamlined process from the feds, like the accountability and assessment waivers we got last year, that would just be a one-year change and be tailored to these kinds of conditions. And I would say that if we try to do it without them saying you can do it, it would just be a waste of effort on the part of the personnel who are doing that. We've seen that in states like South Carolina, Georgia, Michigan, who said that, well, we're filing for a waiver for assessment next year, and that's really what led to Secretary DeVos's letter.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So Scott, based on the discussion we had at the first part of this meeting about growth and accountability, I think on this topic, it's actually pretty clear that the AAPAC, and members feel free to jump in and correct me, is in favor of taking steps to mitigate accountability, both federal and state, based on the 2021 school year assessment results, which that then is essentially the direction to work with. The language of this, my question could be different, but it feels like the Assessment Accountability Policy Advisory Committee would request that the board begin taking steps to mitigate or relieve schools of accountability determinations based on the 2021 school year.
I think that's accurate. Brent says yes.
So that might be the new question for this item that we have.
Right. I agree. So I think that is the item. So, we just voted to not calculate growth for accountability. And so does that mean that folks, I assume it does, mean that people would support what Darren just said and not calculate accountability, assuming we get the right permissions in 2021? Both, and I think, Darren, you mean both federal and state?
That's how I've interpreted the discussion.
Okay. Me too, yeah. Sarah says yes, Brent says yes.
How does that impact our turnaround schools? Does that force them into an additional year, or would we need to just put in some waivers where they can use some other accountability measures?
And Michelle, have you guys been thinking about that?
Yes, a little bit. This past year, without accountability data to exit schools from turnaround, the board was generous enough to allow us to go through kind of an interview process with schools that were eligible to exit with a review panel and make recommendations. So it is possible we could consider that again for state turnaround. I think that the requirements for CSI and TSI may be a little bit different on the federal side, and that we would need to also define in an addendum our plan for.
Yeah, so sort of like applying a small school review to all those turnaround schools. Basically, what data they have and interviewing and to try to make sense of what kind of progress they're making, right? Is that what you were doing? Sounds like it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And we already have some language in our ESSA plan that allows us for what we kind of call a second tier review, which is essentially a panel review of additional data from the school.
Okay. So that's a good plan. That means they're not stuck in purgatory forever. They have an opportunity to get out. So I'm seeing all yeses. I haven't seen anything other than a yes. I haven't seen everybody respond.
Scott, I put in the chat. Some language that maybe we would use in the recommendation that would go back to the board. like the committee members to look at that, and if there's changes to that, let me know. Otherwise, if that is consistent with what the group is recommending, I'll go forward with that.
Rich likes it. Brent likes it. Sherry likes it. That's good. Got all the important folks right there, so just kidding. Leanne likes it. Ashley likes it. Good.
So again, I will, in my recommendation, will consider this to be unanimous support from the voting committee members, unless someone feels differently. Put that in the chat, and I'll be able to record that accurately.
Right. Board member Cannon supports it. Christie supports it. Board member Earl supports it. Brent's voting multiple times. Uh-oh. Election fraud. Oh, sorry. Okay. Next topic. So one of the things that people are rightfully saying is we need test data, as Damien talked about, as a flashlight to help us figure out what's going on. And Darren talked about this as both as his role as a district person, as a principal, and other roles as a parent, to get a sense of how, what kind of gaps we're seeing, what kind of shortfall in learning we're seeing. The New York Times Magazine last weekend had the cover on the magazine section was the lost year. Pretty dramatic, right? They're trying to sell papers. But the idea that people are really worried about this. Well, what if we can't get good assessment data? Or even if we can get decent assessment data, what information do we need to help us properly interpret these data? So there's a whole area of educational indicators, excuse me, called opportunity to learn indicators or opportunity to learn data. And many of the cross-national programs like PISA or TIMSS collect some types of these opportunity to learn data. And at the simplest level, you could think, well, we don't teach geometry, I'm just making this up, in 10th grade. And there are a lot of geometry questions on the 10th grade PISA, and our kids in our country didn't do well on that. That, in some sense, is an opportunity to learn. The kids did not have an opportunity to learn geometry before that test. There's a very well-known program in the United States called Surveys of the Enacted Curriculum. University of Wisconsin initially housed that along with CCSSO. I think it's in the public domain now. And it could take teachers and school principals, an hour or so to complete it, but it gets into very great detail. In many testing programs, people ask, the testing programs have asked some very simple questions of kids at the end of each testing session. So how, for instance, you have a bunch of questions and you would ask the kids, how often do you see problems like this on the in your classroom? And you might say the response might be every week, once in a while, never, something like that. Or how often does if it's a writing assessment, you might ask, how often does your teacher give you feedback on your writing? And that's a way to get at some of these opportunity to learn questions at the student level. And so if we're able to assess and we see these different kinds of score gaps than we've seen before, or either the same groups and locations are favored or not favored, or if things switch around, this opportunity to learn data could help us contextualize the results if we're able to collect the data and And if we don't have the assessment data, it can help us direct resources and support to places where it seems clear students do not have meaningful opportunities. I want to get to Jennifer's question in the chat about the school climate data. Yeah, school climate part, depending on the questions, some of them, might get at things that are more about feelings about feeling welcomed in school, which is not irrelevant at all. But the kinds of but there are other things about more academic or learning kinds of things, and so we could think of these questions at different levels of the system and of responsibility. So, for instance, there are things like technological capacity, bandwidth, and devices. It's hard to place that responsibility solely, if Utah works like most other states, on the school. It's usually a district decision about providing kids with Chromebooks or things like that, et cetera. So the idea of bandwidth is certainly not a school's responsibility. That they don't control whatever internet provider comes to your community and how that gets spread. So some of that's a state and community responsibility. There are other things now that we move to remote testing. Some of these might be beyond what we want to think about, but what if there were, because of certain areas, maybe because they rely more on things like tourism and hospitality, there were significant drops in income and employment levels among community members, and people were really now struggling that hadn't struggled. That would have an effect on kids' ability to learn and perform. That would be one thing. Again, these are outside of the school per se. More home environment kinds of questions. This you could ask the student. You could perhaps do a parent survey, but what type of workspace does a student have to do his or her work? Some kids maybe have a quiet place in which to do work where they're not bothered by siblings or others. Probably that's not the case in most households. In many households, kids are sharing spaces, sometimes with multiple siblings, sometimes with just a few. But think about trying to be on a Zoom, and we're all doing it now, right? If you had, other people sitting near you all doing different Zooms or different, webinars. So that affects in remote settings, the quality of engagement. One of the things we're all wrestling with is what counts as a meaningful engagement. So some people are talking about, number of assignments or, types of assignments completed. But we all know that you could be on one of these webinars all day long and never really engage. So is it a certain amount of eye contact? Is it a certain amount of completing responses to polls or questions, or is it actually completing a piece of work and submitting it? Instructional practices and classroom routines. We think there's likely a difference between those who are able to operate synchronously, that's a split off there, versus asynchronously. It's to be attached to the other synchronous, and that could have an impact. What about those who made an effort to prioritize standards versus those that didn't? And then these kind of enacted curriculum questions, like I mentioned before, how often did you see these concepts in class? How regularly do you see problems? And then we have to ask how these indicators interact with things like race and class. So the question, I guess, for AAPAC, and we're going to talk about this in more detail with TAC, is do you recommend USBE pursue the development of opportunity to learn data collections, and at what levels should they be focused? Should they be focused at district levels or and all of the above is an acceptable answer at student levels, at parent levels, at teacher levels. Some people even talk about things like teacher logs. That sounds pretty obtrusive, and it likely is, but there's other ways of collecting data from teachers, just asking about the things they prioritize, the content standards they prioritized in their classroom that year. Again, things like, as we go remote, getting a good sense of which kids are actually checking in some way, shape, or form. The reports I saw last year were 35% of kids were never checking in, didn't check in for the last 7 weeks of the school year in certain places. That certainly says that they didn't have an opportunity to learn at least what was supposed to be instructed. So let me stop here. I see there's been some chat. I haven't been able to follow it about this. There's a question about the climate survey that's being administered, and Jennifer and Michelle saying some of the questions might be relevant. And then it's currently scheduled for administration in this school year 21. Is that next year, Darren, you mean? Or this is current year?
No, the graduating class is school year 21. So this fall,
Okay.
this winter is moving forward currently, federally.
Yeah.
Scott, and this is Board Member Earl, I'm trying to understand exactly what this is. Is it more surveys? Is it more something a teacher fills out? I'm not seeing the need for what you're saying. Is this more assessments? Because if it's more of something that's not going to benefit the learning, and I know we're doing or at least it says opportunity to learn, but what this is requiring is more and more data. So someone's got to enter something, or someone's got to survey something. So I'm not sure I'm fully grasping exactly what this is, what these data points are, or how we're collecting them.
Well, we haven't decided yet. So there's it's through surveys, through web-based surveys, through if we're able to give a test, for instance, it's easy to add a few questions to the end of every student's test session. Just quick retrospective, like how often have you seen questions like this? To these surveys about, again, remote spaces. That could be a parent survey, and things about technological capacity. What type of internet capabilities do you have in your house if in fact it's remote? So it could be some parent/student surveys. It could be questions appended to the test, and it could be surveys of district leaders and school leaders and teachers as well. There's various levels. One of the advantages of collecting it across multiple levels is you get a more 360 view of it, and that way you don't have to collect as much information from any one level. Does that raise more questions?
It does kind of to me.
I know.
So anyway.
I know you're worried about the privacy, but this would allow us to direct resources if in fact we found that, certain kids were just not connecting at all to online learning.
Yeah, I worry that the larger it gets from the schools, the students, and the teachers themselves, the more it's about something other than, it becomes this broad dialogue versus a teacher honing in on the needs of specific kids. And so we do have our surveys that are coming out. It would be beneficial to look at what we've already got available and just do that before we duplicate anything. So.
Okay. Thank you. Ashley, I see you raised your hand.
I just wanted to say that in some similar surveys, not for this exact type of information gathering, but for planning for the academic year, it seems like some districts had certain demographics oversampled when they did parent surveys. Like I have X percentage of minority students, but almost every person completing the survey is like a white middle class family from the same neighborhood. And that provides its own inference, but I would think parent surveys are always going to be problematic in like who completes the survey, whether or not they have access, and also who wants to share information like that about themselves.
Right.
And then if it goes to teachers and administrators, I think sometimes teachers especially do this type of thing for compliance. Like, yes, I had meaningful engagement, check. Like they want to show that they were compliant with what was asked.
Yeah.
And that it would have to be clear, like really clear to get the true information and not the we were compliant, like we followed the rule. And the last comment is really, well, it's not a comment, it's a question, is how something like this would capture sort of COVID-related flight of students. Like secondary students were going to finish everything online at a private school, you know, or like change districts, but then I'm going to go back to my other district if this ever ends. So how would something like this capture flight between districts and charters and private schools as far as groups that will really return to some other place in future years?
So I don't know that it could capture that, but district, enrollment folks could probably indicate, I mean, I'm sure they do already, changes in enrollment. I don't know if they capture where the kids went, but I remember we used to do more stuff with attendance with the state. And Darren, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure you guys collect data on all sorts of attendance related stuff and enrollment patterns. So I'm sure those data are there, and we could look at. That's an interesting thing to look at. Actually, what's been the change in enrollment in Utah public schools over this last year compared to where it had been previously? I think that's an interesting thing to look at.
Yeah, so Scott, there are some, as you define opportunity to learn data, some of that is collected in our daily UTREX upload. Obviously, enrollment information, students knowing which school they're primarily enrolled in. We have a fairly large number of students in our state who are dual enrolled, meaning they're enrolled in 2 LEAs at the same time. Oftentimes, that's a brick and mortar and a online learning situation. Sometimes it's 2 brick and mortar schools, though, or 2 online learning settings. Obviously, attendance, traditional attendance marks, we were able to see that without creating an additional burden on LEAs. Engagement, though, that becomes much more challenging at the state level. We don't have currently a good way to measure engagement levels. The schedule that students are enrolled in, if they're part-time, full-time, the LEAs upload their school schedules to USBE, so that information is available. I think the challenge is a lot of the stuff that's really specific to COVID-19 changes. That's data that state education agencies don't have access to in an easy format. You'd rely on LEAs and schools would be much closer to it and would be able to do some analysis at their level. But at the state level, there are some challenges there for us with the current data that we have available.
Yeah, that's an important point because historically, most states haven't collected these. Even something like, we'd have to define engagement first, right, and then have people come to a clear understanding what that meant. And it could even be the case to encourage LEAs to collect some of these data just to use locally. But there could be certain things if, in fact, I do think it's going to be an important source of data that's maybe less onerous in one way than test data. And it's, and maybe schools, I would think, would feel better about saying, well, yeah, my kids didn't do so well, but only half the kids in this is an exaggeration, in the school had reliable internet access. Maybe it's not an exaggeration. And so how could they have, so we did, what used to be called blizzard bags or other types of, paper packets of stuff. And it's not the same when they can't get online. So I think that for school folks to know if we actually could collect assessment data, I think they'd want to have their results contextualized in some of these other things. The question, of course, is how to collect this in ways that don't create one more burden. It's going to create a little burden, but how do they not create a massive burden on someone in a district office?
Well, the comment that you made about the ability to add questions to the assessment itself, that one has some interesting elements to it. It's not unlike ACT then. ACT has the student survey that they have students complete prior to taking the ACT, or they give students the opportunity to complete the survey. And that, I think, Scott, that's the kind of thing you're talking about with opportunity to learn. They ask students to tell them which classes they've taken before, and a bunch of other questions. The thought of doing that inside of one of our state assessments is something I personally had not considered. And I guess that's something that this group could weigh in on. I obviously wouldn't make that action unilateral. That would be something that I would seek board direction on if we were going to add questions. And then we would have to obviously work with our vendor to try to get that in place pretty quickly.
So the advantage is if you could matrix sample those. So if you had a large enough school, you don't have to ask all kids all questions. And so you get, let's say there were 20 really great questions you wanted to ask. You could split them up into 4 forms and have each kid only take 5, and you can mix them up so that at a school level, you get lots of information about the 20 questions, but no kid has to take all of them. So it's not time intensive that way.
Depending on your questions, you may have to get parental consent. So and I'm not, once again, I'm not sure where we're weaving into things here. So we just really have got to be conscientious of that. And any data we collect, we need to know what the purpose is. We shouldn't be just collecting data to collect data, but there should be a direct purpose to it.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, Board Member Earl. And I think here the purpose is twofold, right? If it's going to be folded into the assessment, then we're obviously giving the assessment. It'll help us understand how to interpret the results a little bit better. If it's separate from the assessment, it might help us in case there is no assessment to actually figure out where there are potential larger gaps looming. So I think those are the two approaches. But I guess what we're looking for now, we don't have a definitive plan. We wanted to just weigh this idea, have the AAPAC weigh in on this idea, and general advice. We're bringing this in a little more detailed way to the technical advisory committee meeting, and thinking about things about level of the system, burden, and privacy is something that Board Member Earl will make sure is part of every discussion about this.
You can count on it.
I know. So I'm going to move us on because we have other things to do. I think, Anne Michelle, I think this is you leading this.
Sure, I'm happy to talk about this. So in the federal waiver that was granted in the March of last year, it was clear that one of the agreements that states made if they applied for the assessment and accountability waiver was that they would not identify any new schools or exit any schools from CSI and TSI, effectively pushing pause on their status for this current school year. So we want to think ahead and kind of be ahead of the game of how we might approach identifying schools or exiting schools in 2021 with perhaps partial data. Is that a wise decision? Is that a valid decision, I think, is the question. I was speaking about the addendum process earlier, and I have heard some implied or signals that around those conversations that the U.S. Department of Education is asking for states to define their CSI and TSI identification and exit timelines in their addendum. Even if it's just this year is on hold, we will start identifying and exiting schools next year. They want to know through the addendum what the plan is for states. And a big question is the implication for Title I schools that are currently in TSI rolling into CSI if they don't exit, and overwhelming the capacity of the state to support those schools. And so those are just some of the questions and considerations that around CSI and TSI that I think.
So, and Michelle, do you have a question for the APAC then? Do you want them to, is this just for information? You want
This part's information. You can move on,
Okay.
I think.
All right. Here's a recommendation. Oh, this is a different recommendation. Yeah.
It is a different recommendation. I guess maybe the last bit was just informational about, as we think about the addendum, that we need to also make considerations for CSI and TSI and how we would include that in the addendum. So a question that came from the Utah Assessment Directors Association raised concerns about accuracy and rounding rules for identifying schools for as low performing. That currently we round to the 1,000th place and set that cut score of the lowest 3% or 5% very precisely. But UAD's concern was that identifying a school because they are 1/1000th of a point below or above is a concern. So USBE is considering rounding the calculation to the 10th place only and employing standard setting rules around determining.
Standard rounding rules, not standard.
Thank you. Standard rounding rules around identification. As I've looked at the data, when you decrease the precision by decreasing the rounding to the 10th place, it identifies more schools, which speaks to the previous point about schools being, overwhelming eventually the capacity of the state to support schools in CSI. So the question for APAC members is any thoughts or recommendations about changing this business rule?
Hey, and Michelle, this is Sherry. Did you do any sort of investigation on making a compromise and maybe going to the 100th place? Did that significantly increase, decrease? What happened?
It's a happy medium between the 1,000th place and the 10th place. It is something certainly this group could recommend.
But I do want to say, just to be clear, just to make sure we're clear in the language, it's not really precision because we add more decimal places. So it wouldn't the system wouldn't be more precise if we added 5 more decimal places. It would just look more precise. All right, the underlying system is no more precise because we have the 1,000th place versus the 10th place. It's just, we're just taking care, or just delaying when we do our rounding. But the overall quote unquote reliability of the system is not different. And so the question is, you should only have as many places as you really have reliability in your system. So in other words, do we think there's a difference between a school that is, just above the cut at 004 versus 006, I would say there's no difference in those schools. It's questionable whether there's a difference in the whole number. So that's why I would, even though, Sherry's rightfully worried about, we're going to identify more schools or not, I have to believe that'll come out in the wash unless something I'm not understanding. If we do it that way, if we use the standard rounding rule, I don't know. I don't know if Damien, you're still on. You want to weigh in on this, or Leslie?
It sort of reminds me of the significant figures.
Yeah.
That comes up in measurement science. So I'm not totally familiar with the numbers associated with that, but thousandth place seems to be quite a ways out there.
Yeah. And we rely on Damien for all things math. Damien's his first PhD was in math, and he was completely crazy enough and got one in measurement. So that's I go to him for my math questions. So I guess we want the APAC members to weigh in. And does anybody have any opposed to changing these rounding rules? And it was a recommendation from, what do you guys call your group, Sherry and Hal? Utah Assessment something. There's another U in there.
UAD, UAAD, Utah Assessment, Utah Association of Assessment Directors.
I got it. Okay. And so this is the recommendation from them. I see no reason. And does anybody else see a reason to go against this? I think it's a thoughtful recommendation. And Michelle, are there any issues that you guys see other than potentially more schools?
No, just my observation that it would likely identify more schools, and consideration and concern for, like I said, that potential for TSI schools to be identified as CSI.
Okay. Anyone else? Darren, you want to weigh in on this?
No, it looks like we have agreement. No one's opposed to that movement. I know on the next slide we have one more recommendation we'd like the group to consider. Yep. 11 minutes to go in our time. I think we can do it.
Yeah, we can do this. So I think many of you are familiar with this, that when identifying the EL student group for TSI, the indicator points for the English learner progress are not included in that calculation for this particular group. When we were, and Rich may remember this, that back in 2017 when we were thinking about this in a very abstract and hypothetical way, and how CSI and TSI interacted, it seemed to us at the time that including the EL progress indicator points in the EL student group would essentially double the weight and potentially over-identify EL students, the EL student group for TSI. Frankly, as we actually went through the process and applied the rules, we see now that that is not, that our thinking from 2017, it doesn't actually work that way. So this is just a proposal and a recommendation from UAD as well to calculate the EL student group the same way that we calculate TSI for every other group, including, and we would include the EL progress indicator points in the calculation.
So any thoughts about that? Again, this was a recommendation from the UAD group, and makes sense, right? I mean, USB is behind it. Anybody opposed to this? It just makes things parallel, which is always nice. Brent, it seems equitable.
So let me just make sure I'm understanding. Originally, the thinking was that they would be receiving kind of like double credit, so to speak, a little bit for any gains, and that didn't turn out to be the case. And so we want to make sure it's a balanced system. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yes, that's a good summary, Jenny. Yes, thank you, board member.
Okay.
Yeah, so Board Member Cannon says the kids get credit for improvement they deserve. And Tracy says by not including it the way it was, it naturally becomes less emphasized. Okay. Rich supports the amendment. Sherry supports, she's just happy we brought the UI concerns. She's not saying if she supports it. I assume you supported Sherry. And then she does. And so Hal supports it. Anybody not support it? I think it's a pretty easy one. I think you have your answer, Darren.
Yeah, and it's, when you say easy, I do want to call attention to that second bullet. This one actually would require, we've talked about an addendum and an amendment to our consolidated plan. This one would require an amendment to the plan.
I would emphasize that it may require, if this is the proposal that AAPAC recommends, we would look with probably our policy advisor, Jeff Van Holten, at our state plan language to determine if an amendment is required. But I think there's a potential also that it may not require amendment. But we will go through whatever process we need to. It should be pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I was going to say, when I read the plan and looked at it, it really implied that it was already being done, quite frankly. And so when you go to a school that had a lot of EL students and you showed them the data and how the box was empty, the credibility of the system took such a big hit when I went to talk to school principals on their action plans around TSI. So this helps the credibility of the systems with those direct people who are working with EL learners, I promise you. But I really felt the federal plan, it was really connotated that it was being done. Just like Scott said, it seemed odd not to have it there. I think it should be straightforward, I hope.
That's my impression as well, Hal. But I think it would be wise to seek, at least confirm that with our policy advisor to make sure. But we did write the TSI language intentionally to be quite broad. So I think that this may not require an amendment. If it does, we're happy to go through that process. We've successfully done another amendment, and it was a good experience. So as Scott said, I think USDE is behind this as well, that we just standardize the calculation for all student groups and not treating the EL student group any differently. Not that that was our intention. Our intention was to be more equitable, but in the actual application, we learned that we weren't thinking about it as it actually came out in practice.
Okay. Thanks, Anne Michelle.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a half an hour more of slides and 5 more minutes, so we're not gonna torture you, I promise you. I just very quickly, the structure of the work, many of you were involved in already, the assessment work group, where we actually just should move over a little bit. We're past the community conversations, and we've actually had a review of the report. We're about to start series 3 series of webinars on September 24th, and our goal is to wrap up by November. Darren, I'm not gonna say any more than that now. I think that we're probably done.
Yeah, I agree. It's good work that's being done there. It's difficult work to try to come up with a report that the committee as a group supports and wants to advance to the board for consideration. But it's exciting work, and I look forward to the conclusion of that, and then using that plan to guide decisions for years into the future.
Sounds good. Well, I think, Darren, we're 3 minutes to go. I think unless anybody has any other last questions, I think it's a full day.
If you just go to slide 70, let's put up the date of our next meeting.
Oh.
And add that to your calendar. Please note it's a Thursday. It'll be the same time of day. We'll send out official calendar invitations if we don't already have one. Check on that from 1 to 4. As Scott has talked about, this group typically meets in conjunction with the Technical Advisory Committee, which has a little bit different purpose. They will bring in experts from universities across the country to help make technical recommendations and advise us as we work with the board to implement world-class assessment and accountability systems. Typically, that group, I think, Scott, you know this better than I do. I think it's been a history for some period of that time. This group, the AAPAC, would meet at the conclusion of the TAC meeting. After a day and a half of TAC meetings, we've not been able to do that for various reasons over the last, really since the time I came to the state board. Yeah. So it's been nearly 3 years. We're getting back for this one in February, and we're back to that setup. And so the advantage of that is we'll be able to give AAPAC an overview of TAC recommendations or issues that they want to advance forward that are policy related to the AAPAC group. So we'll have to be able to review their work and respond to that. So there's an advantage to that. I'm looking forward to that as well. So again, I want to thank Scott, Damien, and Leslie from the Center for Assessment for your work in preparing the technical information in our slide deck, and Michelle also for putting work into the slide deck preparation. And then for each of you, your service on the those of you who are members of AAPAC, both voting and non-voting. I appreciate your willingness to be part of this group. And then the USB assessment staff for taking your time this afternoon to be online and to help respond to questions as they come up. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Darren, there's one more question just before we go. Leanne asked if the Community Conversations webinar is available for viewing. Is that gotten posted, do you know? You guys had that whole shutdown last week anyway. So.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Leanne, for that reminder. I've not posted it. Leslie has provided me a link to the video presentation, and I have not posted that yet. I appreciate the reminder, and I will get that taken care of.
Will that be through that one document that we have where all of those things are viewed for the work group?
Oh no, I think it's going to be. Oh, I don't know, Darren.
That's actually a wonderful idea to keep it consolidated. Scott, if you're okay with that,
Leslie could post that right away. Yeah.
Okay, I looked for it and it wasn't there. I wasn't able to attend, but I'd really love to see what was said. So thank you.
Yeah, Leslie, you could post that pretty soon, right?
Yeah, I'll let you post it in the next few minutes. Sure. Yep.
Right.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Well, great. And Hal's offering to meet earlier if conditions change and we need to have a ad hoc meeting. It makes sense. Now that nobody has to travel, it makes it easy. So.
Yeah, and then Brent, what's his question to me is private. So I was going to tell him we'll talk offline on that anyway. The question that he had for me. So.
Okay. All right. Terrific, folks. Have a good evening, and I'm sure I'll see all you work group members soon next week. So, all right. Thanks, Darren.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.